Is Poland Europe's next leader? I just recently came back from a trip to Poznan. That's Poland's fifth largest city, and it was amazing. A lot of people have noticed that the big cities are quite impressive. You have wonderful, picturesque, little small streets and beautiful town squares. There's a lot of culture, a lot of history taking place. The cafes and restaurants are full. There's a lot of dynamic happening on the street. Everything is pretty neat overall. I was even lucky enough to visit a wine festival that was taking place over the weekend. And as I was walking through the very lively spots of Poznan, I couldn't help but think that this is a new leader in the making. I've had several touch points in my life with Poland. I grew up in Western Germany, and as a child of the 90s, I remember that there were very, very strong stereotypes directed towards Eastern Europeans, but particularly Polish people. It was quite nasty. I remember people holding this cliche that Poles were only coming to Germany to steal cars. The perception of Eastern Europe after the implosion of socialism was rather bad, and Poles hit it quite hard. However, I was lucky to experience Poland from another side myself. In 2005, when I was a teenager, I had the opportunity to partake in a 2-week school exchange. In 2005, Poland looked a little more like what you would expect from a former socialist country. I'm myself partially Bulgarian, so I know how socialist countries looked like after the 1990s. And Poland fulfilled some of those criteria. There were potholes, the infrastructure was not as developed. You could still see a lot of socialist old buildings and obviously a lower life standard. 2013, I decided to study for a year in Poland, in Wrocław. That's the third largest city of the country. Already then, I noticed that there was some convergence towards Western cultures taking place. First of all, I noticed that there were more international fashion brands and food chains who had entered the country. In 2013, Poland had already established itself as a manufacturing hub in Europe. Germany had outsourced part of the automotive and machinery production to Poland, which created a lot of jobs and people benefited from that. However, the mood was still rather skeptical. I remember in 2005, but as well in 2013, talking to the Polish peers that I met, the perspective for many of them was that the best thing you could do was to leave the country. Particularly in the 2000s, the unemployment rate was very, very high. The high unemployment rate, but as well the memories of the very difficult 1990s were something that young people my age were still remembering. After the so-called shock therapy in the 1990s, Poland went through a very, very rough period. Privatization came at a high cost. People lost their jobs because a lot of companies didn't generate enough profit, so they were closed. But in the 2010s, things were definitely shifting, and there was a lot of development taking place in the bigger cities. I saw that firsthand. What is astonishing to me is that you can really feel and see how much life quality has improved for a lot of people. Now, when I was in Poznan, as I said, it was incredibly charming. Streets were full. But what I noticed viscerally was the level of optimism. People were just relaxed in the streets, enjoying a good time with their family and friends. There are several factors which position Poland to be one of the key leaders in the European Union over the next years. First of all, we have defense and diplomacy. Ever since the Russian full-scale invasion on Ukraine, Poland has taken center stage in pushing for more European defense systems. Poland is very dedicated to the NATO, and the country is currently spending nearly 5% of its GDP on defense. No other European country comes even close. In the first months after the Ukraine war broke out, you could see how Polish politicians, particularly then Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki, was urging Germany's then Chancellor Olaf Scholz to be more brave and to send tanks and other military equipment to Poland. Since the outbreak of the war, Polish politicians are always seen between Germany's chancellors, currently Friedrich Merz, and France's Emmanuel Macron when it comes to summits on defense and diplomacy. This military ambition is partially driven by Poland's historic grievances with Russia, but it attracted a lot of attention. In a time when Europe feels rather cautious, having a country taking bold stances will automatically generate a lot of attention. Poland has become an agenda setter when it comes to defense and strategy. This in itself is so remarkable. If you think about the military tension of the Cold War, it would be unimaginable to think that Western allies and Germany would cooperate with Poland, a former socialist country and member of the Warsaw Pact, in defense questions. This is already quite remarkable in itself. Another key factor, in my opinion, is the level of optimism that I just noticed. Poland doesn't just feel optimistic, the data actually backs this up. The Eurobarometer data of spring 2026 shows that Poland is a lot more optimistic than most European nations. Poles are more optimistic when it comes to their country's economy, their personal job situation, and as well their household situation. Additionally, they show above average trust in the European institutions. This This may come as a surprise to some people who associate Poland with the Kaczynski years, Euroscepticism, and attacks on the rule of law. But Poland is quite a diverse country. Not everybody is subscribing to those policies. As a matter of fact, the majority of Poles view the European Union as something positive. And I think optimism isn't just a nice thing to have in a society. Optimism can be the fertile ground for entrepreneurship, for innovation, for new ideas. And this is something that Europeans desperately need at the moment. Optimism as well can be a driver of social cohesion. And I'd applaud Poland if they modeled how to find cohesion in those politically polarizing times of crisis. This optimism doesn't come from nowhere. Poland has had one of the strongest GDP growth rates over years. The economy has grown so much that Poland has become the 21st country whose economy surpassed the threshold of 1 trillion. Within less than a generation, the market multiplied more than tenfold. Even though defense optimism and a strong economy point towards Poland becoming one of Europe's leading nations, the country might not be there yet. First of all, there are downsides to having a strong economy, and that is a high labor demand. After decades of brain drain, Poland now is seeking international labor force to satisfy the hunger of its labor market. This is a completely new situation for Poland. Last year, I interviewed political scientist Dr. Zara Boyarczuk, who is based in Warsaw, on the question of how immigration is currently shaping Poland. I will link to her interview so you get a glimpse of how Poland is currently experiencing the situation of needing international labor migration. Another key factor that is important is that GDP growth in itself doesn't mean that things are fine for everybody. I like to look at purchasing power as an indicator and compare European countries based on that to get a sense of how much people can afford. Eurostat creates an indicator where 100 is the baseline of the average of what Europeans can afford in purchasing power. As you can see, wealthier nations are having a higher level of purchasing power, so they can afford more. Poland at the moment sits below the average. This can be easily explained by the regional disparities. Traditionally, the West has been economically a lot stronger than the East. Additionally, there's quite a noticeable gap between rural areas and the big cities that are the economic hubs of the country. And the last aspect that explains why Poland might not be perceived as a European leader so far is its relationship to the European budget. The European budget is being negotiated in 7-year cycles, and the member states negotiate how much money they want to pool for European projects. Typically, it is a solidarity based system where stronger economies contribute a lot more than they would get, while countries that still need to do some catching up receive a higher share of European funds more than they contribute. The reason for this is the belief that the European single market is crucial for all European members. So contributions of stronger economies to weaker economies are perceived as a long-term investment. When weaker economies grow strong, everybody in the single market benefits. That's the logic. For instance, French high-end manufacturers can import more high-end goods to Eastern European countries when they're catching up. In the current budget cycle, Poland is Europe's largest net beneficiary, at least when we talk in absolute numbers. If we break it down to per capita rates, Poland is at the end of the contributors list. As the case of defense spending has shown, if you want to be respected, you need to crank up your contributions. Just as the international community is impressed by Poland's high defense spending, it would be very impressed if Poland switched aside from being a net beneficiary of European funds to a net contributor. If Poland basically signals that they do not need those European funds anymore, they will be considered to be an established economy that can rely on its own funds. The trajectory is that the Polish economy is going to keep on growing. And then the question arises, is there a will to lead? And this is something that the Polish citizens and policymakers have to decide on their own. I genuinely wonder if the self perception of Polish citizens and the political system has kept pace with the impressive GDP growth rate. I know that in a lot of former socialist countries, there's a certain inferiority complex because of the depressing 90s and 2000s. A lot of Eastern Europeans have idealized the West and wanted to emulate the West. The self perception was often the one of being a follower and not a leader. And I'm really curious if Polish people are updating this mindset. Now, I'd love to read some Polish people dropping me some comments. I would really love to see another country balancing the classic German French axis of power. Above all, because I think it would balance out the historic experiences of the Cold War period. I'm quite certain that Poland is going to take more and more of a prominent position in international politics and in the EU. But tell me, what do you think? Is Poland the next leading country of the European Union? If you like this video, feel free to subscribe. On this channel, I want to do more content about European culture and society. So I'll be glad if you join me on this journey.